It was a Thursday afternoon in early June, and the city of Columbus, Georgia lay sprawled along the eastern bank of the Chattahoochee River, drowsy under a heavy blanket of heat and humidity. The calendar read June 4th, 1953, and for most folks in town the day had started like any other. By 2 o'clock the sun was a white-hot disk in a pale, milky sky, and the air felt thick enough to wring out. Downtown Columbus, with its red brick storefronts and wide streets, hummed with the ordinary sounds of commerce. Cash registers ringing, car engines idling at stoplights, and the distant clatter of freight trains shifting cars in the rail yard near the river. Men in short-sleeved shirts and women in cotton dresses moved slowly, trying to stay in the narrow strips of shade cast by awnings and elm trees. It was the kind of heat that made a person wish for a thunderstorm just to break the stillness. But the stillness was deeper than most folks realized. Out in the western corner of Muskogee County, just across the state line from Alabama, the air had begun to stir in ways that were not normal. Farmers tending fields of cotton and corn noticed a strange, pressing quiet. The birds had stopped singing. The leaves on the oak trees hung limp as if waiting for something. A few old-timers looked up at the sky and saw a faint greenish tint along the western horizon, a color they did not like. They remembered stories their grandfathers told about the great tornadoes that had swept across the South in the decades before. But the world was modern now. Weather forecasting was better. Surely the newfangled radar stations and the Weather Bureau in Atlanta would catch anything serious. So they shrugged and went back to work. In the heart of Columbus on Broad Street, a young woman named Evelyn Chandler was folding a stack of new blouses onto a display table at the J.C. Penney department store. She had worked there for 3 years, ever since she finished high school, and she knew the rhythm of a slow afternoon. The store was quiet, with only a handful of customers browsing the aisles. The overhead fans spun lazily, pushing warm air from one spot to another. Evelyn glanced at the clock above the mezzanine railing. 2:45. She thought about the meatloaf she would make for supper if the weather broke and the power went out. Her mother always said that meatloaf was the one dish you could fix even when the lights were dim. She smiled at the thought and turned to help an elderly woman who was trying to find a pair of cotton gloves. 3 miles to the north, in the small community of Bibb City, a textile mill churned away, its windows open wide to catch any breeze. Inside the mill, the roar of looms and spindles drowned out nearly every other noise. Men and women worked in rows, their hands moving in practiced motions as they fed thread into machines. The air smelled of oil and lint and sweat. At the far end of the building, a supervisor named Ray Thompson checked his pocket watch and made a note on a clipboard. He had been in the mill for 22 years and he could feel weather changes in his joints. His knees had been aching since noon, a familiar warning. He walked to the nearest window and looked out at the sky. The greenish tint was more pronounced now, and the clouds were gathering into a low, boiling shelf that stretched from the southwest all the way to the northwest. Ray felt a chill run up his spine despite the heat. He shouted to a foreman to shut down the looms for a safety check. The foreman argued, saying it would cost production time. Ray did not argue back, he simply pointed at the sky. Within minutes, the great machines groaned to a halt and a strange quiet fell over the mill floor. At the same time, a few miles south of downtown, near the sprawling Fort Benning military installation, a cavalry sergeant named Earl Peters was teaching a class on map reading to a group of young soldiers. The classroom was a Quonset hut with corrugated metal walls that amplified every sound. Sergeant Peters was a stocky man with a gravelly voice and a calm demeanor. He had served in the Second World War and had seen enough bad weather in Europe to know that the American South could produce storms just as ugly. When the light through the hut's small windows turned a dull yellow-green, he paused in the middle of a sentence. The soldiers looked at him, confused. Then they heard it, a low, persistent hum that seemed to come from the ground itself. It was not the sound of a truck or an airplane. It was something else, something that made the hair stand up on the back of Sergeant Peters' neck. He ordered the men to get down under their desks. Some of them laughed, thinking it was a drill, but Peters did not laugh. He had been in a tornado once before in Oklahoma in 1947, and he remembered the way the air turned to solid noise. Up in the sky, the storm was organizing itself faster than anyone had expected. The cold front that had swept down from the Great Plains met a wall of humid Gulf air that had been baking over Georgia for days. The collision was violent and sudden. Thunderheads rose like dark towers into the stratosphere, their tops flattened into anvils that spread for miles. Inside those clouds, winds began to rotate. A mesocyclone formed, a spinning column of air a mile wide, and it began to tighten to accelerate. The funnel cloud dropped from the base of the storm, a gray, writhing rope that seemed to feel its way toward the earth. It touched down in a field of soybeans near the Alabama line, tearing a narrow path through the plants before lifting and skipping, then touching down again. The first person to see it was a sharecropper named Luther Green, who was working his patch of land about 8 miles west of Columbus. He saw the funnel touch and rise like a giant finger testing the ground. He dropped his hoe and ran for the root cellar, yelling at his wife and children to get inside. The tornado was not yet at full strength. It was still growing, drinking in the unstable air, feeding on the temperature difference between the surface and the sky. As it moved east, it crossed into Georgia and began to widen. The color darkened from gray to black to a deep, churning brown, colored by dirt and debris. The sound changed, too, from a roar like a freight train to a deafening, continuous rumble that vibrated in a person's chest. The tornado was now a half-mile wide, and it was heading straight for the northern edge of Columbus. Inside the J.C. Penney store, Evelyn Chandler heard the sound before she saw anything. It was a low, rumbling drone that grew louder with each second. She looked at the customers who had stopped shopping and were staring toward the front windows. The glass panes began to rattle. Then the lights flickered and went out. Someone screamed. Evelyn grabbed the elderly woman's arm and pulled her toward the back of the store, toward the stockroom where there were no windows. But there was no time. The front of the store exploded inward, not with a bang, but with a sucking, popping sound as the pressure dropped and the windows blew out. A wall of wind and debris swept through the aisles. Evelyn was thrown against a display case, and the world became a chaos of flying glass, torn fabric, and roaring darkness. In Bibb City, Ray Thompson had just ordered the workers to move away from the windows when the steel roof of the mill began to peel back like the lid of a sardine can. The tornado struck the building with the force of a bomb. The walls buckled, the support beams twisted, and the entire structure seemed to lift and shift. Workers were thrown across the floor. The air filled with lint and splinters and the sharp smell of torn metal. Ray Thompson tried to hold on to a drill press, but the wind plucked him off his feet and slammed him against a pile of raw cotton. He felt the breath leave his lungs and then felt nothing else. At Fort Benning, Sergeant Peters had his men under the desks when the Quonset hut began to tremble. The corrugated metal walls groaned and popped as the tornado passed less than a quarter mile to the north. The windows shattered, but the building held. Peters counted the seconds, 20, 30, 40, and then the noise began to recede. He looked up and saw a patch of gray sky through a hole in the roof. The tornado had missed them, but he knew that meant it had hit someone else. Indeed, the tornado was now at its peak, a monster 3/4 of a mile wide, with winds estimated at more than 200 miles per hour. It carved a path through the northern neighborhoods of Columbus, leveling homes, tossing cars, and snapping telephone poles like matchsticks. In the community of Baker Village, a cluster of wooden houses built for military families, the storm hit with almost no warning. A few residents had heard the warnings on the radio, but most had dismissed them as just another thunderstorm. When the tornado struck, houses imploded and exploded in the same instant. Families huddled in bathtubs and closets. A woman named Martha Gibbs had just put her 2 young children into the hallway when the roof of her house vanished. She threw herself over them, covering their bodies with her own. The wind tore at her dress, pulled her hair, and tried to pry her fingers loose, but she held on. The storm passed, and she lifted her head to see nothing but sky where her living room had been. Her children were alive, sobbing but unhurt. By 3:15, the worst was over. The tornado continued east for another 4 miles, flattening farmhouses and tearing through patches of woods before it finally lifted near the Chattahoochee River. In its wake, a swath of destruction stretched 15 miles long and nearly a mile wide. The city of Columbus would count 18 dead that day, with more than 200 injured. Hundreds of homes and businesses were destroyed or damaged. The mill at Bibb City was a ruin of twisted steel and broken machinery. The J.C. Penney store was missing its entire front wall, and the merchandise lay scattered across the street, mixed with glass and debris. But in the first moments after the storm, there was only silence. The roar had stopped. The wind had died. And the people of Columbus, Georgia, stood dazed among the wreckage, trying to understand what had just taken place. The greenish sky was gone. In its place was a pale, watery afternoon light filtering through dust and smoke. Somewhere a car alarm was blaring, a dog barked, frantic and lost. And then a human voice cried out, a thin, desperate call for help. That sound broke the spell. People began to move, to dig, to search. The work of survival had begun. And then a human voice cried out, a thin, desperate call for help. That sound broke the spell. People began to move, to dig, to search. The work of survival had begun. Evelyn Chandler opened her eyes to a world she no longer recognized. She was lying on her side, wedged between a collapsed display case and a pile of torn fabric. Her ears rang with a high-pitched whine that drowned out all other sounds. She tried to move her legs and they responded. She tried to push herself up and her arms held. Slowly, painfully, she crawled out from under the wreckage. The J.C. Penney store was gone. What remained was a cavern of twisted metal beams, shattered glass, and scattered merchandise. The front wall had simply disappeared, and through the gaping hole she could see the street, which was littered with debris. She saw a mannequin's head lying in the gutter, staring up at the sky with its painted eyes. She saw a cash register upside down in the middle of the road. And she saw a woman, the elderly customer she had tried to help, lying motionless near the entrance, covered in a fine gray dust. Evelyn crawled to her, felt for a pulse. There was none. She sat back on her heels, trembling, and let out a sob that was swallowed by the silence. Outside, the streets of Columbus were a maze of obstacles. Cars were overturned, trees uprooted, power lines drooped like dead snakes across the pavement. A man named Wilson Carter, a mechanic who lived on 10th Street, had been in his garage when the storm hit. He had thrown himself under a workbench and listened to the world come apart. When it was over, he crawled out to find his house reduced to a pile of splinters. His wife, who had been in the kitchen, was sitting on the front steps, clutching a bag of flour she had somehow managed to save. She was crying, but she was alive. Wilson put his arm around her, and together they walked into the street to see what had become of their neighbors. The scene that greeted them was one of stunned disbelief. The block looked as though a giant hand had swept across it, leveling everything in its path. Houses that had stood for decades were now heaps of wood and brick. A bathtub sat in the middle of the road, still attached to its pipes. A child's bicycle hung from the branches of a mangled oak tree. People emerged from basements and closets, blinking in the strange light, calling out names. A man named Howard Sims found his wife pinned under a fallen bookshelf. He lifted it off her with a strength he did not know he had, and she gasped and clutched his hand. They sat together on the curb, her head on his shoulder, as the first sirens began to wail. The sirens came from Fort Benning, where the tornado had narrowly missed the main cantonment area but had still caused significant damage to outlying training facilities. Within minutes of the storm's passing, the base commander ordered every available vehicle to respond. Jeeps, trucks, and ambulances rolled through the shattered gates and into the city. Soldiers in olive drab uniforms fanned out into the neighborhoods, carrying stretchers, first aid kits, and crowbars. Sergeant Peters, the man who had ordered his men under their desks, led a squad of soldiers into Baker Village. He had seen combat in Europe, but this was different. There were no foxholes here, no enemy lines. Just ordinary people, many of them the wives and children of soldiers, buried under the ruins of their homes. Peters and his men began digging through the debris with their bare hands, listening for cries. They found a young mother and her 2 children huddled in a closet, their faces white with dust. The mother pointed to the back of what had been her bedroom, where a crib lay crushed under a fallen wall. Peters looked at the crib, then at the woman's eyes. He said nothing. He simply turned and motioned for his men to move on. In another part of Baker Village, a soldier named Private First Class Tommy Barnes pulled a little girl out from under a collapsed porch. She could not have been more than 5 years old. Her arm was bent at an unnatural angle, and she was screaming, but she was alive. Tommy carried her to the street and handed her to a medic, then went back into the wreckage. He did this again and again until his hands were raw and his uniform was soaked with sweat and blood. He never asked whose blood it was. At the Bibb City Mill, the scene was one of industrial carnage. The steel frame of the building had twisted into a skeletal shape, with jagged edges pointing in all directions. Rescuers had to climb over piles of shattered machinery, their boots crunching on broken glass and torn cotton. Ray Thompson, the foreman who had ordered his workers away from the windows, was found unconscious but alive, pinned under a large wooden spool of thread. It took 4 men to lift it off him. He had a broken collarbone, several cracked ribs, and a deep gash on his forehead, but he would survive. Others were not so lucky. 3 of his workers had been killed instantly when a section of the roof collapsed. Their bodies were discovered later, covered in a thick layer of cotton lint that made them look like ghosts. The injured were taken to the Columbus City Hospital, which quickly became overwhelmed. Doctors and nurses who had been off duty were called in, and they worked through the night without rest. The hallways were lined with stretchers. The emergency room was a sea of patients with cuts, bruises, broken bones, and head injuries. A makeshift triage station was set up in the hospital's lobby, where a team of nurses sorted the wounded by severity. The most critical cases were rushed into surgery. The less critical were treated in the waiting rooms, in the cafeteria, even in the chapel. A young doctor named Robert Landers performed an emergency amputation on a man whose leg had been crushed by a falling beam, using only a scalpel and a bone saw he had to sterilize with alcohol. The man survived. Dr. Landers would later say that he did not remember the details of that night, only the faces, the blood, and the endless sound of human pain. As the sun began to set, the full scale of the disaster became clear. The tornado had carved a path of destruction that stretched from the Alabama line to the Chattahoochee River, 15 miles long and nearly a mile wide at its widest point. In all, 18 people had been killed. More than 200 were injured. Hundreds of homes were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. The economic loss was estimated in the millions of dollars, a staggering sum for a city of about 70,000 people. But the dead were not numbers. They were names, faces, stories. There was Martha Gibbs's neighbor, a young father of three who had been driving home from work when the tornado struck. His car was found wrapped around a telephone pole, and he was found 100 yards away. There was the elderly couple who had lived on Oak Street for 40 years. They were found in their living room holding hands. There was a baby who had been born just 3 days before the storm. The baby's mother had been in the hospital and the baby was safely with relatives. They survived. But the baby's father, who had been at the mill, did not. The Red Cross set up emergency shelters in churches, schools, and community centers. Cots were laid out in rows, and volunteers served coffee and sandwiches to anyone who came. The Salvation Army dispatched canteen trucks to the hardest-hit neighborhoods, offering hot soup and kind words. The National Guard arrived to secure the area and prevent looting. Though there was little to loot, most of what was left was debris. The city's mayor, a man named J.B. Wiggins, declared a state of emergency and begged for federal aid. He stood on the steps of the courthouse, his voice hoarse, and said that Columbus would rebuild. But even as he spoke, he knew that some things could never be rebuilt. The night of April 30th, 1953 was cold and clear. The stars came out, indifferent to the devastation below. In the neighborhoods that had been spared, people lit candles and gathered on their porches, talking in hushed voices. In the neighborhoods that had been destroyed, people huddled in makeshift shelters, wrapped in blankets, trying to sleep. The sirens had stopped. The search had ended. Now there was only the long, slow work of mourning and rebuilding. The next morning, the survivors woke to a world that smelled of wet wood, gasoline, and dust. The sun rose pale and watery, illuminating a landscape that seemed foreign. Streets that had been familiar were now unrecognizable. Landmarks were gone. The Bibb City Mill, which had been the heart of the community, was a ruin. The J.C. Penney store was a skeleton. The houses of Baker Village were a patchwork of rubble and twisted metal. But already the people of Columbus were beginning to move. Neighbors helped neighbors sort through the wreckage. Volunteers arrived from nearby towns, bringing food, clothing, and tools. The Red Cross set up a temporary office in a former grocery store, and long lines of people waited to register for assistance. The American Legion and the veterans of foreign wars organized search parties to look for anyone who might have been missed. The city's churches held prayer services, not just for the dead but for the living, for the strength to go on. One of the most remarkable stories to emerge from the aftermath was that of a man named John T. Fuller, a retired Army colonel who lived on the outskirts of Columbus. Colonel Fuller had been a meteorologist during the war, and he had an amateur weather station in his backyard. He had watched the storm approach on his barometer, and he had tried to warn people, but his phone calls had gone unheeded. After the tornado, he wrote a detailed report that he sent to the U.S. Weather Bureau, describing the conditions that had led to the storm. His report was studied by meteorologists for years and contributed to the development of better warning systems. But for most people, the storm was not a scientific event. It was a personal one. It was the memory of the sound, the color of the sky, the smell of the air. It was the feeling of helplessness as a force greater than any human power swept through their lives and left them changed. It was the knowledge that they had survived and that others had not, and that the line between the two was thin and random. In the weeks that followed, Columbus slowly began to heal. The rubble was cleared, the buildings were rebuilt. The Bibb City Mill rose again, bigger and stronger than before. The J.C. Penney store opened a new location downtown. Baker Village was reconstructed, and the families who had lost everything moved back in. The wounds healed, though the scars remained. But the people never forgot. Every year on April 30th, a small ceremony was held in the city park, where a memorial stone listed the names of the 18 who had died. The ceremony was quiet, not a spectacle. The mayor spoke, a minister prayed, and a bugler played taps. The families of the victims would lay flowers and then they would go home. And for the rest of the year, life went on. The Columbus tornado of 1953 was not the deadliest tornado in American history. It was not the widest, the fastest, or the most destructive. But it was the storm that taught a generation of Georgians that the sky could turn green, that the air could roar, and that everything they had could be taken away in the space of a few minutes. It taught them to listen to the warnings, to respect the clouds, to build stronger houses and better communities. It taught them that survival was not a matter of strength or courage, but of luck and love. And that is the story of the tornado that visited Columbus, Georgia, on an afternoon in late April 1953. It is a story of wind and silence, of fear and hope, of loss and recovery. It is a story that lives on in the memories of those who were there and in the bones of the city that rebuilt itself from the rubble. It is a story that reminds us even now that we are never as safe as we think we are, and that the sky, for all its beauty, can sometimes turn against us. but it also reminds us that when it does, we can hold on. We can dig. We can carry one another out of the wreckage, and we can begin again. The story of the Columbus tornado did not end with the clearing of rubble or the laying of memorial stones. It continued in the lives of those who had been touched by the wind and lived to tell about it. There was a woman named Helen Roper who had been hanging laundry in her backyard when the sky turned that sickly green. She saw the funnel cloud touch down less than a mile away and ran inside, grabbing her two young children and pulling them into the bathtub. She covered them with a mattress and lay on top of them, praying aloud as the world around her disintegrated. When the storm passed, she crawled out to find her house gone, her clothesline snapped, her garden torn to pieces. But her children were alive. She held them so tight that her arms ached for days afterward. Helen Roper would never hang laundry on a cloudy afternoon again without glancing at the sky first. Then there was the story of a man named George Hendricks who had been working at the Bibb City mill when the tornado struck. He had taken shelter under a heavy table in the break room, and when the roof collapsed, the table saved his life. He emerged with only minor cuts, but the mill was destroyed and his job was gone. George was 45 years old with a wife and 3 children, and he had spent 15 years working at that mill. He had no other skills, no savings to speak of, and no idea what he was going to do next. But the people of Columbus did not let him figure it out alone. A local carpenter named Sam Pritchard heard about George and offered him an apprenticeship, teaching him how to frame houses. Within a year, George had become a skilled framer, and he helped rebuild many of the homes that the tornado had destroyed. He often said that the storm took away his old life, but it gave him a new one too, one that he never would have found otherwise. The children of Columbus were affected in ways that would take years to understand. In the weeks after the tornado, teachers in the city's schools reported that many of their students were having trouble concentrating, that they were jumpy and quick to cry, that they seemed haunted by something they could not name. The school board brought in a child psychologist from Atlanta, a woman named Dr. Eleanor Vance who specialized in trauma. She spent a month in Columbus, meeting with children individually and in groups, helping them to process what they had seen and heard. She taught them to draw pictures of the tornado, to tell stories about it, to put their fear into words. She told them that it was okay to be scared, that the storm was not their fault, and that they were safe now. For many of the children, Dr. Vance was the first person who had given them permission to talk about what they had experienced. Her work in Columbus became a model for how to address trauma in children after natural disasters, and she would later write a book about it. The city's churches also played a crucial role in the long healing process. Reverend James Caldwell of the First Baptist Church lost his own home in the storm, but he did not miss a single day of ministering to his congregation. He conducted funerals for 7 of the 18 victims, and he visited every family in his parish that had been affected. He stood in the ruins of homes and prayed with people who had lost everything. He organized a network of volunteers to help with cleanup and rebuilding. He preached a sermon on the Sunday after the storm that was so powerful, so filled with hope and grace, that it was reprinted in the local newspaper and read aloud in homes all across the city. In that sermon, he said that the tornado was not a punishment from God, but a reminder that life is fragile and precious, and that the only response to tragedy is love. The rebuilding of Columbus was a massive undertaking, one that required the cooperation of the entire community. The city government, led by Mayor J.B. Wiggins, worked with state and federal agencies to secure loans and grants for homeowners and businesses. The Red Cross provided temporary housing and food. The Salvation Army distributed clothing and blankets. The local chapter of the American Red Cross, run by a tireless woman named Margaret O'Brien, kept detailed records of every family that needed help and followed up with them for months afterward. Margaret O'Brien was known for her gentle voice and her iron will. She would not rest until every family in Columbus had a roof over their heads and food on their table. One of the most challenging aspects of the recovery was dealing with the psychological aftermath. Many survivors experienced what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, though that term did not exist in 1953. They had nightmares, they flinched at loud noises, they felt a constant low-level anxiety that would not go away. Some turned to alcohol, others withdrew from their families and friends. A few could not bring themselves to stay in Columbus, and they moved away, hoping to leave their memories behind. But for most, the only way to heal was to stay and face the place where the storm had happened, to rebuild their homes and their lives on the same ground that had been broken. There was a man named Walter Simmons who lost his wife in the tornado. She had been in the kitchen when the house collapsed, and he had been in the basement. He heard her scream, and then he heard nothing. He dug through the rubble for hours, but by the time he found her, it was too late. Walter Simmons was a quiet man, a carpenter by trade, and he had been married for 23 years. After the funeral, he went to his workshop and started building a rocking chair. He worked on it every day for 6 months, carving the wood, sanding it smooth, assembling it with precise joints. When it was finished, he gave it to the church to be used in the nursery. He never explained why. He just said that he needed to make something beautiful out of the pain. The city's industry also had to rebuild. The Bibb City Mill was the largest employer in Columbus, and its destruction had thrown thousands of people out of work. The mill's owners, the Bibb Manufacturing Company, announced within a week that they would rebuild on the same site. They brought in construction crews from as far away as Birmingham and Atlanta, and they worked around the clock to get the mill operational again. It took nearly a year, but when the new mill opened, it was even more modern than the old one, with better ventilation, stronger beams, and a new emergency warning system. The mill workers returned to their jobs, grateful to have work, but they never forgot the day the roof fell in. The schools in Columbus also had to adapt. Several schools had been damaged or destroyed, and classes were held in churches, community centers, and even in tents. The school board approved a bond issue to build new schools, and they designed them with tornado safety in mind. The new buildings had reinforced interiors, designated shelter areas, and better communication systems. The students were taught what to do if a tornado warning was issued, and drills were held regularly. These safety measures, born from the tragedy of 1953, would go on to save countless lives in the years to come. The city's infrastructure also underwent changes. The power and telephone companies buried their lines in the hardest-hit areas, reducing the risk of electrical fires and making the system more resilient. The water and sewer systems were upgraded. The city council passed a new building code that required stronger foundations, heavier roofing materials, and more substantial framing for new construction. These codes were controversial at first. Some builders argued that they were too expensive and unnecessary. But after the first major thunderstorm the following spring, when the new roofs held and the old ones did not, the critics fell silent. The National Weather Service, as it is now called, also learned from the Columbus tornado. At the time, the United States Weather Bureau was still in the early stages of developing a reliable tornado warning system. The Columbus storm provided valuable data about how tornadoes form, how they move, and how they can be predicted. Meteorologists studied the weather patterns that had led to the storm, the conditions in the atmosphere, and the behavior of the funnel cloud. They analyzed Colonel Fuller's report and incorporated his observations into their models. Within a few years, the Weather Bureau had established a network of spotter stations and radar installations that could detect tornadoes before they touched down. The system was far from perfect, but it was a start, and it was built on the lessons of storms like the one that hit Columbus. The anniversary of the tornado, April 30th, became a day of reflection for the city. In the first year after the storm, the ceremony at the park was small but deeply moving. The mayor spoke, a minister prayed, and a bugler played taps. The families of the victims laid flowers on the memorial stone, and the names of the 18 who had died were read aloud. There were tears, but there were also smiles, as people remembered the lives that had been lived and the love that had been shared. In the years that followed, the ceremony grew. The local schools held assemblies, teaching students about the history of the storm and the importance of preparedness. The newspaper published special editions, with stories from survivors and photographs of the recovery. The ceremony became a way for the community to honor its past while looking toward the future. One of the most touching traditions that grew out of the anniversary was the planting of a tree for each of the victims. The first trees were planted on the first anniversary, and the idea caught on. Every year, new trees were added, and now the park is a small grove of 18 oaks and maples with a plaque at the base of each one. The trees are not just a memorial, they are a living reminder that life continues, that growth is possible, that beauty can emerge from ruin. As the decades passed, the survivors of the Columbus tornado grew older and their memories began to fade. Some of them moved away and some of them passed on. But the story of the storm was passed down to their children and their grandchildren, who learned it at family gatherings, in school lessons, and in the quiet moments when a grandparent spoke of the day the sky turned green. The grandchildren of the survivors grew up knowing that their city had been tested by wind and had not broken. In the 1980s, a local historian named Dr. Patricia Gregory began collecting oral histories from the survivors. She interviewed more than 50 people, recording their stories on audio tape and transcribing them into a book that was published by the Columbus Historical Society. The book is called The Day the Sky Roared, and it is still used in local schools today. Dr. Gregory wrote that the survivors did not see themselves as heroes or victims, but as ordinary people who had lived through extraordinary circumstances. They did not want to be defined by the storm, but they did not want it to be forgotten either. They wanted future generations to know what had happened, so that they would be prepared, so that they would understand the power of nature, so that they would cherish the fragile gift of ordinary days. In the 1990s, the city of Columbus commissioned a memorial wall on the grounds of the city hall. The wall is made of smooth gray granite and it bears the names of the 18 victims, along with a brief description of the storm and the date it occurred. At the base of the wall, there is a small fountain, and the sound of the water is a gentle counterpoint to the weight of the names. The wall is a place of quiet reflection, where visitors can sit and think about the lives that were lost and the community that rebuilt. As the new millennium approached, the generation that had lived through the storm was in its twilight years. Many of the survivors had moved on to other cities or other lives, but some remained in Columbus, watching as the city grew and changed. They saw new highways built, new neighborhoods spring up, new businesses open. They saw the old mill sites redeveloped into shopping centers and apartment complexes. They saw generations that knew nothing of the storm, that could not imagine what it was like to stand in the rubble of your own home. But the survivors knew. They carried the memory of the tornado in their bones, in the way they looked at the sky on a cloudy afternoon, in the way they held their loved ones close when the wind began to blow. One of the last living survivors, a woman named Evelyn Grant, celebrated her 100th birthday in the summer of 2023. She was interviewed by a local television station, and she told the reporter that she remembered the tornado as if it were yesterday. She remembered the sound, the color of the sky, the way her mother had pulled her into the basement and held her so tight that she could barely breathe. She remembered the silence after the storm and the long, slow walk through the debris. She remembered the kindness of strangers, the food and water that appeared from nowhere, the hands that helped her family dig through the wreckage. And she said with a smile that the storm had taught her that love is the only thing that lasts. Everything else can be taken away in an instant, but love stays. The legacy of the Columbus tornado is not just in the memorials and the safety codes and the scientific advances. It is in the hearts of the people who survived and in the hearts of those who heard their stories. It is a reminder that nature is indifferent to our plans, that the sky can turn against us without warning, and that the only defense we have is each other. It is a story of loss, yes, but also of resilience. It is a story of a city that stood up after being knocked down, that rebuilt its homes and its schools and its factories, that honored its dead by living fully. It is a story that continues to unfold. Every time a child in Columbus asks a grandparent about the day the sky roared, and the grandparent pauses, looks out the window, and begins to speak. They speak of the day the sky turned the color of a bruise, and of the sound that was like 1,000 trains passing through a single tunnel. They speak of the stillness afterward and the strange silence that was not really silence at all but the absence of every familiar noise. And as they speak, the listener leans in because the story is not just about the past. It is about the present, about the fragility of life and the strength of a community that chose to hold together. The grandchildren of the survivors grew up with a peculiar awareness. They knew that a clear blue sky could become a weapon in the time it took to walk from the kitchen to the mailbox. They knew that the weather radio in the corner of the living room was not just a decoration. They knew that when the sirens sounded on the first Wednesday of every month, it was not a drill for a war that might never come, but a drill for a storm that had already come once and could come again. This knowledge was not a burden, it was a gift, passed down like a family heirloom. It gave them a respect for nature that was not fear but a kind of reverence. One of the grandchildren, a man named David Grant, Evelyn Grant's great-nephew, became a meteorologist. He was born 10 years after the storm, but he grew up hearing his great-aunt's stories. He wanted to understand the science behind the terror, to find a way to predict the unpredictable. He studied at the University of Georgia and then at the National Severe Storms Laboratory in Oklahoma. He spent his career refining the algorithms that color the radar maps on our television screens today. He often said that the Columbus tornado was his origin story, the moment that set him on a path he never deviated from. He would look at a storm cell on a computer screen and remember his great-aunt's voice describing the green sky. And he would know that his work was not just about numbers and models, it was about giving people time. Time to get to the basement, time to hold their children close, time to say goodbye. David Grant retired in 2018, and on his last day at the lab, he gave a short speech to his colleagues. He told them about the Columbus tornado, about the 18 people who died, about the thousands who survived. He told them that every second of warning he had helped to create was a debt repaid to those 18 souls. He said that the storm had taught him that the most important thing in his field was not the technology but the trust between the forecaster and the public. If people do not believe the warning is useless. And trust is built one storm at a time, one honest story at a time. That trust was tested again in 2011 when a massive outbreak of tornadoes swept across the South. On April 27th of that year, more than 200 tornadoes touched down in a single day, killing over 300 people. Columbus was not hit, but it was close. The sirens wailed, the sky turned that familiar shade of green, and the city went into its practiced routine. People who had never lived through the 1953 storm knew exactly what to do. They had been taught in school, they had seen the memorial wall, they had read The Day the Sky Roared. The drills and the stories had done their work. That day, the death toll in the region was devastating, but in Columbus, every single person who took shelter survived. The legacy of the old storm had saved lives. After the 2011 outbreak, the city held a special ceremony at the memorial wall. The mayor at the time was a woman named Amelia Torres, who had moved to Columbus as a child in the 70s and had grown up hearing the stories from her neighbors. She spoke of the connection between the past and the present, between the 18 who had died and the hundreds who had been spared. She said that the Columbus tornado was not just a tragedy, it was a teacher. And the lesson was still being learned. In the years that followed, the city continued to invest in preparedness. The tornado sirens were upgraded to a digital system that could broadcast voice messages, telling people exactly what to do and where to go. The schools held yearly tornado drills that were as rigorous as fire drills. The local news station, WTVM, dedicated a segment of its weather coverage to tornado safety every spring, and they often featured interviews with survivors or their descendants. The story of the storm became part of the civic fabric, woven into the way the city thought about itself. One of the most unexpected legacies of the Columbus tornado was its impact on the arts. In 2005, a local playwright named Sarah Millwood wrote a play called Green Sky, based on the oral histories collected by Dr. Gregory. The play was performed at the Springer Opera House, the same historic theater that had been damaged in the storm and repaired. The production was a critical success, and it toured several other cities in Georgia. Millwood said that she was drawn to the story not because of the destruction, but because of the way the community had responded. She wanted to capture the moments of kindness, the small acts of heroism, the way strangers became neighbors in the space of a single afternoon. The play ended with a scene of the survivors gathering at the park a year later, planting the first tree. The final image was of a single oak sapling standing against a clear blue sky. The play inspired other artists. A composer named Robert Dalton wrote a piece for string quartet called April 30th, which premiered at the Columbus State University Schwab School of Music. The piece was haunting and beautiful, with a recurring motif that sounded like wind. Dalton said that he wanted to evoke the feeling of standing in the aftermath, the strange stillness, the sense of something lost and something found. The music was recorded and later used in a documentary about the storm that aired on Georgia Public Broadcasting. The documentary itself became a part of the legacy. Titled The Day the Sky Roared, after the book, it featured interviews with survivors, historians, meteorologists, and city officials. It showed grainy black and white photographs of the destruction, but it also showed the rebuilding, the new houses, the new schools, the new hospital. It showed the faces of children playing in the park where the grove of 18 trees stood. The documentary was shown in schools across the state, and it was also uploaded to YouTube, where it has been viewed more than 500,000 times. Comments from viewers around the world often express astonishment that such a small city had endured such a catastrophic event and emerged stronger. In 2020, during the coronavirus pandemic, the city could not hold its annual memorial ceremony. The park was empty, the memorial wall was quiet, but the community found a way to remember. A local florist organized a campaign to place a single rose on each of the 18 trees. Volunteers wearing masks and maintaining distance carried out the task. Photographs of the roses were shared on social media, and the story of the storm once again brought people together in a time of isolation. It was a reminder that memory is not dependent on a single day. It is carried in the heart every day. As the 75th anniversary approached in 2028, the city began planning a major commemoration. A committee was formed, including descendants of survivors, local historians, city officials, and representatives from the National Weather Service. They decided to build a new exhibit at the Columbus Museum dedicated to the tornado and its aftermath. The exhibit would include artifacts from the storm, such as a twisted piece of steel from the textile mill, a child's doll found in the rubble, and the original siren that had sounded the alarm. It would also include interactive displays showing how tornado forecasting had evolved, and a listening station where visitors could hear the oral histories recorded by Dr. Gregory. The committee also planned to install a time capsule at the park, to be opened in 2078, 125 years after the storm. The capsule would contain letters from survivors and descendants, photographs, news clippings, and a copy of the documentary. The mayor at that time, a young woman named Jessica Chan, whose grandmother had survived the tornado as a child, said that the time capsule was a way of speaking to the future, of telling the people who would live in a world we cannot imagine that we were here, that we suffered and rebuilt, that we loved and remembered. The 75th anniversary ceremony was held on a cool, clear April afternoon. Thousands of people gathered at the park, filling the space around the grove of 18 trees. The trees had grown tall and strong, their branches spreading wide. The oaks had rugged bark and deep green leaves, the maples flared red and orange in the fall. They were no longer saplings, they were monuments in their own right, living and breathing and growing. The ceremony included speeches, a reading of the names, and a moment of silence broken only by the sound of birds. Afterward, people placed flowers at the base of the trees and lingered in the park, talking and remembering. One of the speakers was a 103-year-old woman named Evelyn Grant. She was frail now, her voice thin, but her eyes were bright. She sat in a wheelchair at the front of the crowd, and when it was her turn, she was helped to a microphone. She did not have a prepared speech. She simply looked at the crowd, at the trees, at the sky, and said, "I was a young woman then with a whole life ahead of me. I thought I knew what the world was, then the wind taught me something else. It taught me that we are not as strong as we think, but we are also not as alone. You see those trees, they were planted for the ones we lost, but they are also for us. Every leaf that grows is a promise that we keep going, so keep going, that is all, keep going." The crowd applauded, and then they stood in silence as a bugler played taps. The sound floated over the park, over the city, over the decades. It was the same tune that had been played at the first anniversary, and it carried the same weight. The ceremony ended, and people began to drift away, some to their cars, some to the memorial wall, some to the coffee shop down the street where they could sit and talk about what they had heard. Inside the Springfield Terrace Bakery, now owned by the grandchildren of the original owners, a television was tuned to the local news. The station was replaying footage from the 75th anniversary, and the customers watched as Evelyn Grant was helped back to her wheelchair. A young woman at the counter said to her friend, "Can you imagine living through that?" Her friend shook her head. "I can't imagine living that long," she said. They laughed, but then they grew quiet, looking at the screen. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, the park was emptying, but the trees stood guard. A couple walked hand in hand past the memorial wall, pausing to read the names. They did not speak. They did not need to. The names were enough. Back in the bakery, an old man sat alone at a table by the window, sipping a cup of coffee. He was a descendant of one of the families who had lost their home in the storm. He had heard the story from his father, who had heard it from his mother. He had lived his whole life in Columbus, had seen the city change and grow. He looked out the window at the park, at the trees, at the sky. It was a clear sky, blue and calm, but he knew, as all the descendants knew, that the sky could change in an instant. He finished his coffee, stood up, and left the bakery. He walked to the park and stood before the grove of 18 trees. He placed his hand on the trunk of the oldest oak, the one that had been planted on the first anniversary. The bark was rough and warm. He closed his eyes and whispered something. Then he turned and walked home. The evening settled over Columbus like a blanket. The lights of the city came on one by one. The sirens were silent. The wind was still. The survivors were almost all gone now, but the memory was not. It had taken root in the soil and in the stories and in the hearts of those who chose to listen. And as long as a child asked a grandparent about the day the sky roared, and the grandparent paused and looked out the window and began to speak, the story would live on. It would live on in the trees, in the wall, in the book, in the play, in the music. It would live on in the way Columbus braces for a storm, in the way the city holds its breath and then when the danger passes lets it out again. It would live on as a testament to the ordinary courage of ordinary people who, when the sky fell, did not run from the rubble but walked into it, reaching out for one another. That is the legacy of the Columbus tornado of 1953. That is the story that continues to unfold. And so the story continues to unfold, not in dramatic headlines or breaking news, but in the quiet moments when a child asks a question and an elder pauses, looks out the window, and remembers. It continues in the annual ritual of the grove of 18 trees, now grown so tall that their branches seem to touch the sky. It continues in the classrooms where teachers pull up the documentary on a smart board and watch their students' eyes widen as the black and white images flicker to life. It continues in the research papers and the weather conferences where Dr. Gregory's data is still cited, still studied, still used to save lives. In the spring of 2030, a new generation of meteorologists gathered in Columbus for a symposium on tornado climatology. They came from universities and government agencies, from Japan and Germany and Australia. They toured the museum exhibit, stood before the memorial wall, walked among the 18 trees. A young researcher from Kansas, not yet 30 years old, remarked that the Columbus tornado was a turning point in the science of forecasting. She said that without the data collected that day, without the careful documentation by Dr. Gregory and the Army Air Forces, the warning systems of today might never have been developed. The symposium concluded with a ceremony at the park. where the participants planted a new tree, a redbud, to mark the nearly 8 decades of progress. The mayor, now a man in his 40s whose mother had been evacuated from Columbus as a child, said that the city had not only survived the tornado but had become a living laboratory for resilience. But resilience is not the same as coldness. It is not a shield against grief. Ask the old woman who still keeps a photograph of her baby brother, lost in the rubble, her only sibling, and who on every anniversary places a single carnation at the base of the oak that bears his name. Ask the man who drives from Atlanta every April to stand in the park and say nothing, just stand, because his father never spoke of the tornado except on that one day, and now the man speaks for him. Resilience is the choice to keep living in a world that has shown you its worst, not because you have forgotten, but because you remember. And so the next door of the story opens onto a summer afternoon in 2035. A group of high school students is gathered in the museum's new learning lab. They are working on a project to map the tornado's path using modern GIS software. They have overlain old photographs onto satellite images, and they are tracing the line of destruction street by street, house by house. One of the students, a girl named Mariana, stops when she sees a house that stood directly in the path. She recognizes the address. It is her grandmother's house, rebuilt after the storm, the one where Mariana spent every summer of her childhood. She had never known that the original house was gone, that the floorboards she walked on were laid on top of ashes. She looks up at her teacher, and for a long moment she does not speak. Then she says very quietly, "My grandmother never told me." And the teacher, who is the great-granddaughter of a survivor, nods and says, "They didn't always tell, they wanted to protect us, but now we have to tell ourselves." The project is presented at the end of the semester. The students stand before an audience of parents, teachers, and city officials. Mariana is the last to speak. She shows the map, the photographs, the data. She explains how the tornado formed, how it moved, how it dissipated. She describes the damage and the recovery. She points to the house, the one in the photograph, the one that no longer exists. And then she says, "But the house I grew up in stands on this spot. And the reason it stands is because of the people who refused to let the storm have the last word. They rebuilt, they planted trees, they told stories, and now it's my turn to tell the story." She stops and the room is silent. Then her grandmother, seated in the front row, begins to cry. The applause that follows is not just for the presentation. It is for the connection, the thread that reaches across decades. Later that evening, Mariana and her grandmother sit on the porch of the rebuilt house, the same porch where Mariana learned to ride a bike, where she read her first chapter book, where she watched lightning storms with a mixture of fear and wonder. The grandmother is old now, her hands trembling, but her voice is steady. She tells Mariana what she never told before. She tells her about the roar, the darkness, the silence afterward. She tells her about the baby brother she lost, the one she never spoke of. She tells her about the days of digging, the nights of waiting, the spring when the first tree was planted. She tells her that every time she hears thunder, she holds her breath. But she also tells her that every time she sees a leaf unfurl, she knows that life keeps coming. Mariana listens. She does not interrupt. She just takes her grandmother's hand and holds it. The sun sets beyond the porch railing. The sky turns orange and purple and then a deep, quiet blue. The air is still, not a single siren sounds. The story does not end here because it never ends. It continues in every generation that chooses to remember, in every heart that beats with the knowledge of what was lost and what was saved. The Columbus tornado of 1953 is not a footnote in the history books. It is a living presence, a warning and a promise, a scar and a garden. It is the reason the sirens are tested every Wednesday at noon. It is the reason the park has 18 trees. It is the reason that when a storm warning is issued, the people of Columbus do not panic. They move with purpose. They help their neighbors, they know what to do. And as night settles over the city, a light rain begins to fall. It taps against the windows of the bakery, the museum, the memorial wall. It drips from the leaves of the oaks and maples, nourishing the roots that grip the soil. In the morning, the rain will pass, the sun will rise, and the trees will sparkle with droplets. The streets will be wet but not flooded. The sky will be clear but not empty. And another day will begin in Columbus, a day like any other, except that it will be built on the unmovable foundation of a day that was like no other. That is the legacy. That is the story that continues to unfold, always in the space between the wind and the silence, between the loss and the life, between the last breath of a victim and the first cry of a child born into a world that remembers.